Okay, good afternoon, everybody. It's my great pleasure and honor to introduce Professor Lina Fruzzetti. Before I go into the formal introduction, I just want to say how happy I am to have her here. She's been my former supervisor, seeing me through my master's as well as PhD, and she's been a great mentor and a friend. So with that, I want to introduce her. She is a professor of anthropology at Brown University. Her research interests are in the areas of kinship, marriage, ritual, and the construction of gender, race, and ethnic relations in India and Northeast Africa. She has done extensive work on caste and the life cycle rights of Hindus, and is now addressing the recent structural changes in the institution of marriages and notions of personhood. Her most recent book on India, When Marriages Go Astray, Choices Made, Choices Challenged, was published in 2013 and is based on more than 4 decades of research in rural West Bengal. It addresses questions of feminism, nationalism, religious identity, and citizenship in post-independent India. She has taught at the universities of Khartoum, Dar es Salaam, University of Helsinki, ICTE, Lisbon, and IIT Gandhinagar. Besides academic publications, she has directed 6 documentary films, including In My Mother's House, which was based on 10 years of ethnographic and documentary work on her mother's life in Eritrea under Italian colonial rule and Ethiopian occupation, her life as a refugee in the Sudan, and finally her return home to independent Eritrea. Her talk today seeks to understand the meaning of development, progress, and change for rural families in the context of their understanding of culture and values in Northeast Africa and possible analogies within the Indian context. Welcome, Professor Fruzzetti.
See, being half Italian, I speak more with my hands than with a microphone. Is okay? Oh, yes, it is. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Shripana, for the introduction. She paid me 10 rupees not to say bad things about her when she was at Brown. That's very cheap. But I also want to thank my other 2 students who are also here. They happen to be doing research here in Bangalore. Andrea Wright, I don't know if she's here. Oh, yes. In anthropology, and Ram, who will be coming late, and he's always late, with a name like Sri Ram. So, I will read part of the paper, and the other part I will talk about it. And I'll try to read slowly. I am myself a refugee from Eritrea. My family moved to the Sudan during the British condominium, where I attended boarding schools in Khartoum. A displaced person living in a diaspora, my own life will be defined by the Society of Refugee Women, whose responsibilities were to safeguard and protect us children. At the same time, I was always aware of other women. I refer to Sudanese women evident in their everyday life, at work, noting their experiences, which in many occasions reflected my mothers and aunts in the camps. Returning to conduct research in the Sudan some 20 years later, it became evident how much of my earlier experience contributed to the success of my own anthropological life, career, and gender awareness. Studying Indian, Ethiopian, Tanzanian, Eritrean, or Sudanese women, my scholarship was clearly defined by my childhood, the familiarity with the other being the Sudanese women, where I too now found myself being that other. Thus, anthropological and intellectual formation became intertwined between text, studies, and everyday. The scholarship that combines and interlocks different strands in an attempt to comprehend the world of women. It is a continuing struggle that demands intellectual and political vigilance on all of our parts. Even when governments create special ministries or offices ostensibly devoted to matters of concern to women, there is an ironic twist, intended or not. The way women are looked at, the way women are treated, and could be succinctly captured in the name of one of the many ministries in present-day Ghana, where there exists a Ministry of Women and Children's Affairs. What are we to make of these? Why not women in education, women in science, women in physics? I suggest that it is not sufficient to point out that there are women ministers, judges, administrators, because the occupation of these positions by some women does not fully address the marginal position of women in many African polities. My point here is to both highlight the specific efforts and contribution of women which are not readily acknowledged, and to remind us of the ongoing struggle to make our studies about change and development more attuned to the situation of women like those in the Sudan that I will discuss today. The topic concerning women and development underscores the so-called challenging or impediment that tradition seems to pose towards change and their continuing social and economic marginalization. To change the lives of women farmers, although not tested in reality, was proven to be arduous and impossible. Development literature assumed the impossible chore before actually testing and assessing the productive potential of women farmers in a rural farming community. Unlike much of the available research that explores and analyzes the impact of mechanized agriculture on the social and economic aspect of rural areas, there is little descriptive and documented material on subsistence farming available from which to draw conclusions about women farmers. Dichotomies such as tradition versus modernity, economic versus religion, real fact versus ideal value, and social basis versus cultural embellishment facilitate only one kind of development, positing contending forces for or against change with indigenous values and social formation, ultimately condemned or at least marked for transformation. Hence, the necessity of studying all cultural and social forms in a small compass in order to see the links amongst them. What do we mean by the concept of development? Quote, if freedom is what development advances, then there is a major argument for concentrating on that overarching objective, close quote, Sen tells us. Development is no longer an economic concern. It is a human problem. The discourse of development is a concept that aims to, quote, remove the major sources of unfreedom, poverty as well as tyranny, poor economic opportunity as well as systematic social deprivation, neglect of public facility as well as overactivity of repressive state, close quotes. We face the challenge of multitude approaches to unravel the meaning of development and tradition in the face of seeking to know the connections between them instead of assumptions that these are disjointed parts of a larger whole. My concern here is the unrecognized contribution of women, the invisible partners in agriculture activities related to subsistence farming. Speaking of development meant that the focus remained on male employment. The acceptance of commercialization and mechanization of agriculture meant the marginalization of women's work in the rural areas, that is, the taming of nature. I will document their roles in the production cycle, their income from non-agriculture to agriculture activities. But how do we recognize this labor? How do we become to understand women's labor, the labor itself? Central to my argument lies the definition of women's labor, the work that they do, and its contribution within the farm and outside of the house. Assessing what is the more productive role that women could play in development process could counteract the destructive politics of food and the spread of hunger in the rural areas. If it is our assumption that development is expected to benefit women, the community and the community at large, so often we find that the process of change tends to marginalize them, while limiting and removing the control over the availability of resources for women. Development tends to address the reproductive burden of women, not their productive possibility. The analytical framework that posits nurturing and liberation as contradictory goals also views women in the rural sector in the third world as not integrated into the development process. The outcome of such analysis is either to reinforce the subordination of women and endorse domesticity, or seek to liberate women from such chores and integrate them into the modernization process. These, without realizing that women are already part of the process itself. Utilizing the family as their unit of investigation, development planners have imposed their own cultural biases with respect to sex role divisions and hierarchical structural models, rather than the culturally contextualized. By that I mean, you already come in with your own assumption and presumption of what the unit of the family is all about. Thus, their push, the developers that is, thus their push for agriculture development and the push for economic growth and progress have focused more on male participation in the production process. I allude here to the classical model of division of labor within the private and public sphere, where male and female roles around either one or the other, and where the home is clearly demarcated and separated from the workplace. And what my research here in this area shows that the two were not clearly separated between house and farm. What has to be stressed is that women's role in the family is socially constructed as a subordinated role, even in the case of a female-headed household. For it is the female role to do the work which nurtures children and men, work which appears to be purely private and personal, while it is the male role to represent women and children within the wider society. This especially refers to, I'm talking about a Muslim community. It is the representative role which confers the social order. Development planners then have tended to reinforce that particular mothering roles of women, often seen constructed from an inner core of the domestic cycle. Building the construction of male and female relations from these models generally cause women to be rejected from being included in major programs, and thus women suffer the consequences when progress is introduced in their community. The persistence of this discriminatory representation of women in the planning process serves to intensify and reinforce inequality, which may already have been there, but now it's strengthened. So over the last 4 or 5 decades, development has successfully and effectively excluded the involvement of women for this very same reason, except in the post-harvest food processing and preservation. What supersedes the untested assumptions about some of the rural farming communities is the actual definition of the family and what it entails regarding the interplay of gender construct and finally the place of tradition and value within the house. That what we see and what we seem to understand has nothing to do with the realities on the ground. Economic growth has tended to reinforce and even extend existing inequalities, as I said earlier. Women are the worst sufferers. They are forced into less profitable position and become even more dependent on men. Prior to that, they were very much equal in the negotiation of daily activities at the household because they both were very equal participants on the farm. Misconceptions and or misconstrued reading of a truly rural farming social structure is the problem, not the women, and their fight is to keep tradition impervious. Women are blamed qua women. The ideological, economic, and legal constructs on their autonomy and the real economic nature of their labor time and activities are often not fully appreciated. The rural family is left to the mercy of how they are defined or understood and how the family is defined, which comes from a definition preconceived from outside. Frequently, when development is introduced into a rural farming community, the design to restructure rural economy, the change it aims to introduce is premised on the assumption that the nuclear household maintains a single exchequer and that its members have a unitary interest. It may be this which above all puts women in such a weak position vis-a-vis their husband and potentially vis-a-vis their own kin. These so-called neat household units, normally male-headed, envisioned by the development planner, soon become transformed by untidy reality and socioeconomic and demographic differentiation develops between and within the social units. It is clear that the division of crops into marketable and consumable food, that is, whether you produce food for the household or whether you produce food for the market, was a product not of European patriarchal culture, but of the process of capital accumulation. Thus, women's loss of status results from the interweaving of class relations and gender relations. This brings us back to one of the earlier studies by Bosrup, which criticized the assumptions that they attribute the provision of food to men in the communities where women are evidently co-partners in the field. To understand the current problem of women's subordination or marginalization in the rural areas, one would have to draw on the inherited colonial model where, in principle, the idea of laboring male and female were reconfigured. European colonial rule, rather than being a liberalizing factor for African women, contributed to their loss of status. Women lost their right to land or their right to use land for subsistence agriculture as a result of the reforms introduced by the colonial administrators then. In fact, the issue has yet to be included in many of the major agricultural surveys that have been conducted. These oversights tend to increase, again, the inequalities. And what follows is simply that the feminization of poverty is increasing in the region, partly as a consequence of high proportion of female-headed households, but that the unfavorable lot of women and children in male-headed households and in agricultural settlements seem to show that these offer no panacea. So there is a discrepancy between women earners and laborers in the field, which results from separation of control of production and the actual work invested on the farm. So in looking at a typical rural family, which I will come later to this, I'll describe it towards the end, is that you see the women very actively involved. This is a Muslim community, but Islam does not sort of limit the possibility of women to work on the farm. They are seen going out every day, every morning, uncovered, working side by side with men. And in fact, 80% of the work can be said that they do the work, except they do not break the land. They do not till the land. They do everything else after that. And there is no restriction on them to be this active. So there is a difference between whether you're working for the household or whether you're working as a paid laborer. In countries such as Sudan, Kenya, and Uganda, women contribute quite a bit. 80% is what I have arrived at by literally measuring how much time women spend on the field. But in most cases, these women are not paid for their labor. This is family labor. This is kinship labor. Kinship labor is expected labor by members of the household. Since it is considered part of the obligation that you have as an incoming wife or a daughter of a family. And the responsibility, and they are clear in the way that they contrast this between traditional and contractual labor. Men can get paid when they go out. Women do not go out of the farms, out of the community to work in other people's fields. So the control over production is separate from the actual work invested on the farm. It becomes clear to use the discrepancy between earners and laborers in the field. Patriarchy, or its underlying ideology, does distinguish between the genders and the respective place within the household and family structure. The resulting effect is the female subordination, which oftentimes accompanies the kinship relations. In the economic sphere, it is reflected first in the sexual division of labor within the family, which makes domestic labor the sole preserver of women and unpaid work for that. Denying them all of these, denying them recognition for labor, for the work done outside of the house. At the same time, it is expected of them to undertake that work, makes them vulnerable when outsiders come to change the whole rural areas. Development planners and investors tend to equate the order and logic of a given society with the pattern of its power relation and power structure. And in the end, their articulation of power and security serves to perpetuate the problem of distributional inequality. In short, development addresses simply the reproductive, and actually talking to some of them would say, it is better if we just leave the women alone in the house and work with the men. They have enough on their hand to take care of their children and so on. So they stress this reproductive aspect of women, not what is possibly the productive side of women. The analytical framework that posits nurturing and liberation as contradictory goals also views women in the rural sector in the third world as not integrated into the development process. The outcome of such analysis is either to reinforce subordination of women, which I will come to it, and endorse such domesticity or seek to liberate women from such chores and integrate them if, in fact, they were accepted into the modernizing process. As I stated earlier then, family labor is still considered and based on kinship. You can't be an incoming wife into a household, in a rural farming house, and say, I do not want to work on the farm, then you starve. Children from the age of 5 or 6 are also expected to be equal participant in the farm. There is a particular kind of weeding that only children with very small hands can do. So there are 3 different kinds of weeding, which is all done by hand. The first one is done by children. The second can be both women and children, and the third is done by women alone. So the norm dictates an obligatory expected role, one invested in the food production for the household. On the other hand, paid labor is based on a contractual understanding drawn between a farmer and another party. And since women cannot draw contracts with outsiders outside of the farm, it's only men who do that. And the discrepancy or ambiguity here concerning what women can actually do and what is culturally expected is clearly comes when outsiders come and do not deal with the women, instead deal with mostly the men. Because culturally, women would not actually even negotiate or talk to anybody outside of the village. So within the village, working out in the field is accepted because this is what everybody expects of their women, irrespective of which household you belong to. So farming is considered still a male role, yet women are active on the same farm as well. There is no existing conflict in the lives of women acting as farmers and acting as mothers. Women will work more than men on the farm, and yet if you interview them, they will say, we are not farmers. We just work on helping my husband's farm. But the work is as arduous or even more so than that what the man does. Modernized agriculture has then entered into this whole scene and introduced the concept of paid wage, labor within the organized and planned rural development without attempting to understand the relationship of work and family, and the idea that a woman is equally active in the field. So the problem faced by women farmers, their exploitation and vulnerability, arise out of ideologies and structure and customs in the sphere of kinship and marriage, politics and law, education and religion, and also the culture and world of women. Women do not represent themselves as farmers. I took a survey of every woman in the 8 villages that I surveyed, And nobody said she's a farmer. They were all said, we don't have a job, we're unemployed. And all the males are either carpenter or they are farmers. And if they were in the presence of women, when I asked them for a job, they said, our women don't work. It's against our culture, against our religion. And I see them going out to work every day. Women do not represent themselves as farmers within the context of household. Working for the family rests under the assumption that one does so as a member of a household. And it's because of this that they don't get included beyond the household to work in something larger. Generally, then, women work within and around the house. Beyond the household will be the farm. Her sphere of what is expected from her is insurmountable. As a woman, she is never free. She has obligation of domestic labor, difficulties in establishing control over her own body, and an inability to be fully a member of society in her own right. She may also obtain her subsistence from men in exchange for personal services of a capitalist labor process. So they understand the dilemma, and even more so when change enters into the villages. That's when it becomes clear for them that they don't have a role in the new mechanized farms, and they become actually abject, and I used the word when I did this study, they re-traditionalized. They're re-traditionalized. Before, they were not really doing traditionally what a typical Arab Muslim woman does in parts of the rural areas. So participating in this venture, in this survey that was run in the eastern part of the Sudan, I had to work with about 50 to 300 heads of household. The study was not primarily to address the life of women. Women were hardly a subject, a paragraph in this huge project, though the study was mostly about how to mechanize the agriculture. I was given the chore to do the survey a year before the project would commence. And it became clear that you cannot ignore the role of women, because I see, in fact, that they do work. I would follow them, like I said, early in the morning, and would come back in the late afternoon. And in the afternoon, they come take care of the children, they cook, and then they have plots around the house that they also work on. And these plots produce cash crops, like vegetables that they grow, and that becomes their own money. And we can discuss where that money goes on, how they spend that particular money. So working with them becomes clear that if this project were to start, that we will see the demise of women's participation in the farm. My concern was that this is a country that has ample land for farming. Nobody owns land. The village owns a whole tract of land, and you can take as much as you can to farm. The normal plot per family, per head of household, would be 7 to 10 acres. And that cannot be done by one man. It has to be done as a family labor. So when that changes to mechanized, you get 30 to 40 acres, a square on the new mechanized field. And women are not allowed to work on that. So it's only men. And you begin to see the difficulty of one man doing that job. Of course, he has tractors. He has the ability to get loans. And I don't know if you heard of the company store. This is where you become indebted, and eventually they leave the farm. So not only have we lost good farm male workers, but on the other side, we also not forget that women have lost a job. They cannot sustain the subsistence farms on their own, because if they were to hire somebody, there is something called the shale system, but money is only given to men and not to women. So even if you are a female-headed household, you have to find a male to stand for you so you can get share. You hire a laborer to work on your farm. So here, what I reported on the study is to highlight the social organization of women, which got completely eliminated. The dissolution of subsistence farming was marked by the demise of the rural family as a unit, and compares well with stories that one hears from other parts of the world with similar kinds of experiences. Now, like I said, the majority are Muslim, they are all Muslim in this town, and culturally, the rural women have enjoyed quite a free access to the ability of going out to work. And when you come into the household, they are actually more attuned about who they are and what their culture expects to them when they come back to the household in the evening or afternoon, and they become much more conservative. But in that phase when they are out in the rural areas, there is no inhibitions. They're actually, you see them working side by side with other women, but also with other men. So that idea of labor then is destroyed when they are not taken into. So the literature on subsistence agriculture is declined, all point to land ownership as the central issue. But some development projects would have been more successful had they recognized the centrality of what constitutes kinship and kinship-based labor, especially in an area where land is neither short, neither owned, neither sold or disposed. It's abundant. Instead, to address the labor invested on the land, they began to address the idea of what a family is, with male head of household and women being subservient and so forth. So excluding them has really left a damaging effect. When I went back 8 years later to the area to see what has happened, you see that many men had left the village to the more mechanized farms, and remittances would be sent, and some would come back, but would not go back to that kind of farming anyway. There is a whole lecture to be given on what happens on the mechanized farms and how that operates and so on. There is a great study by Barnett on the Jazeera scheme, which is one of the classics that have been done to show the demise even of mechanized agriculture, the way it was structured, based on an old English colonial method that was introduced in the 1920s and 30s. An important contributing factor then to this distributional inequality is the lack of service for women. So let's say if women were not included, but they were given services and taught something, even that was in many times not possible. This problem is exacerbated by the inability of an all-male unit to come into the area to introduce progress, to change the social structure. An all-male unit from outside, whether it is Europe or the United States, would just find it very difficult to work with women. And the one thing that I would say, these are okay. You can actually talk to them. You can work with them. They are not bogged down with tradition. If anything, they defy it. And they said, no, we can't be meddling in that. That's the private. We cannot be meddling with the private. So the private became the women who are actually running the farms in the field. And you just could not change their way of thinking to look at this problem differently. I still go back to one of the earlier studies by Lele, who argues that the attention accorded to women by extension services resulted not in the increase of their farm productivity, but in the reduction of their participation in farm activities. So doing this work then became clear that the major disadvantage would be for women. They can't sustain farming when the men leave. They sit and wait, and men, those who are successful, will bring back income. Sometimes the first 7 years are very good, and then you see a decline of that. And they provide for the women, they provide for their household and so forth, but the voice of women become less and less so, because now they are not really partners in the workforce. They are wives, they are daughters, and as wives and daughters, they begin to lose the ability to negotiate for where should this extra income go for, and what should they do with these, and when should the daughters also go to school or simply continue with male supplementary income that the men bring are not in the rights of women. They don't handle it. It's handled by them. So you begin to see all these things that begin to break down. Going back, you can see an increase of multiple marriages. Men bring more wives as a result. And the health and nutrition of the children, for those who are in the health class here, declines. And the reason it declines is that when they produce sesame and millet, there is enough nutrition in those two items that they produce for the household consumption that they could actually sustain and have a healthier dietary. When you change and you bring cash in, and what is available for purchase would be grain, but it was white grain, just white flour, this insipid flour that has absolutely no taste in it and no nutritional value. So the decline in the health of the children becomes very clear. The decline in the rights of women become also less and less so. So even though symbolically she stands as the unit of the family, her honor, her activities reflect the rights of men, reflects the prestige of men, she becomes, though at the same time, less able to talk, less able to be a partner to her husband. So she is still the custodian of everything else that is not economic. Culture, values, beliefs. She is still the custodian of that which gives man his respect in society, even though she is not what she used to be prior to that, where she was a true partner. So men are still farmers. Women work for men. Women more for household, but women don't. I will try to talk less so. Okay. So the community then allows its women, whether married or unmarried, to work. To be active on the farm, to be active in the field, and so on. And there's this cultural understanding that it's fine, it's acceptable. But can a woman then leave the village to find job in a nearby town? That is not accepted. If she were to do that, she would be divorced. And so she sits and waits until she gets remittances from her husband. This so-called progress and development has left an ambiguous situation as to what are my boundaries and what is the limit for me as a woman, as a married woman in this society. So in the Sudan, it does not sort of, it doesn't fall under the category that's referred to as female farming. It's more under the category of male farming, even though like I said, large portion is done by women. So scholars on the rural area, on the rural Muslim family, have stressed the impact of economic growth along with this so-called paradoxical veiling of women, that you do have one, but you also have the veiling of women. What I'm trying to say is that the veiling of women, or the conservativeness that one thinks about when one thinks about rural Muslim women, does not exist in this situation. It doesn't exist at all. I'll tell you where it existed. Because here, you can, true, they are Muslims and they can do everything that's expected of them, but it does not forbid them from doing things out in the public. It is rather the upper class women, those with high and stable incomes outside in the more urban areas, who themselves have opted to a more conservative way of life, so that they can have a different position. It's out but they will not do what the rural women here is upholding, the whole farming industries. To be veiled is an option for them, and they have taken it. These women are not really concerned about the etiquette of whether I'm veiled or not. They're more concerned about how much can I really work to provide for the family. So even though religion has been criticized as one of the force that sort of keeps women backward, I'm arguing against it. That in fact is not the case. Progress has forced women back into the household. Progress and development in the way it was sold has created this problem for women, that now they are forced to be veiled in the rural areas. They are forced to keep inward. There are all these new etiquettes, things that have been introduced that you can be seen but not heard. You have to be more and more conservative in your everyday undertaking. So lower rural women did not have this before. They were unaffected by all of these prior to development in their traditional role. Though their main concern was inhilal, which means the disintegration of their own society if they went a bit too overboard. In a way, very different from what I was talking about, the idea of freedom 2 days ago when I gave the talk in your class. So women are confined to the farms where agriculture is produced for the house, yes. And it is not surprising that the urban-based women fail to recognize the plight of these rural women. I bring it up when I go to the city about what's happening. Oh, thank you. Questions?
Situation here as well. Back in during the medieval times and modern India as well, we had this concept of Brahmanism wherein the upper class women, like how you gave an example of upper class in Sudan. So upper class women here as well would restrict themselves and they would be within their households. So with regard to modern times, what solution do you think shall work? Although this is a very broad topic, I agree. But at least
what solution will work for these women?
Yes.
In Sudan or in India?
You have?
Yeah, now it's growing. Yeah. No, you're right. I was a refugee in this country, so I grew up there and I can see what's happening and so on. When I was there, not being a Sudanese, I didn't have to ever wear a veil and not being a Muslim, so it didn't really affect me. But it wasn't not, my classmates didn't even have this, so they were not thinking of work per se. And they used to wonder why my people, my Eritrean side of the family, were always working. I said, we have to work because we don't have a country, we don't have, our men are back fighting, and we have to take care of ourselves. And so I said, I have no option but to work. And they said, well, then I hope when you finish school, you'll work in something clean. And something clean meant not something that dirties your hand. But when I went to do the work in the rural areas, I realized these women were doing all kinds of activities, and they were so happy doing it because it gave them a sense of freedom. It gave them a sense of freedom to negotiate, like he would tell her husband, no, you cannot bring another wife. One is enough, you have one. You can't bring another one. But when he has the right, and he went over and worked and she wasn't, he could bring one or two. And these are the little changes they begin to see. So that is happening, but the case, so I used to think that if any movement were to come, social movement, the improvement of women and so on, it would come from the rural areas. But I also work in Bengal. I've been working in Bengal for the last 35, 40 years. And even I was an undergraduate when I first went to Bengal. And there I see that the lower caste women have no concern about bhadro this or bhadro that. They work. They have to survive. They work really hard. They do all kinds of jobs. And whereas the upper caste would have no jobs, some of them would just, even there's no income coming. You sell bits and pieces of the house or jewelry to survive, but nobody would dare to go out and work. in non-professional kinds of positions. I think if change were to come, it will also come from the lower, I mean, that's what I said recently. It will also come from the lower castes, where they're very matter of fact. You know, you grow up, you married or not, you know, there is a job, you're going to do it. In the market, there are 3 women. In Vishnupur market, there are 3 or 4 women now, and which I haven't seen. When I first came to, there was no women in the market, and they are members of the bazaar, so they participate in votes and elections and so on. And these women have a voice. People respect them. 2 of them will never get married. I mean, the men say, oh, they're too old now, they won't get, but they're working, they're members of, and they vote, as if the vote was better than the marriage. I mean, but obviously some that's what they thought. But they're very happy working, and they, you know, more, you know, if we see more of these, but other than that, I don't really have an answer, real answer to your question, I mean, how we start the social revolution here.
Would you prefer to take groups of questions or
No,
one
it's
question
okay.
at a time?
It's okay. Do I have to stick? Okay.
Oh, you can choose whichever.
Yeah.
So, to be honest, I know very little about Sudan, and you initially started your talk by saying you yourself are a Sudanese refugee, and in terms of identity, that's where it lends your authenticity when you go back to Sudan. And I was wondering, what the time period you're referring to, is it post-conflict or is it before?
Which conflict?
The recent Sudanese conflict. I mean, the South Sudan
Oh,
has
before.
Before.
And I'm not a Sudanese refugee. I'm an Eritrean refugee in Sudan.
My mistake. You're in
Yeah,
Eritrea. So the women you have you been post-conflict, and these development efforts,
No.
are they post?
No, I haven't been able to go back yet.
So these projects were prior to
Yeah.
the conflict that happened. Okay.
And this is in the east, in the northern part of this. It's not about the south.
Okay. It's in the northern part.
The south is a totally different story. The south is mostly like talking about lower caste women in Vishnupur versus upper caste. I mean, in the south, all women are engaged in some form of activity or the other. And it's a totally different kind of society.
One of your colleagues, Professor Richard Locke, he's done work on the political economy of labor, where I had the opportunity of attending some of his lectures, and it was interesting how he talked about the evolution of sweatshops and how the nature and relationship between the contractor and the people who are working becomes much more and more exploitative as the kinship relation decreases over the course of industrialization. Is that, it seemed fairly similar to the kind of relationship or change in relationship that seems to have happened in Sudan in terms of agricultural labor?
No, it's actually different. Because what is happening is the idea of family labor is not exploited in the same way that you're referring to post or during industrialization with the contract. You work because you know if you don't work you'll die. You won't have food to eat. They produce, as members of a family, they produce enough for a year what their needs would be. And they actually, if they have extra, then they sell that to get cash. The only cash that comes into this family would be the stuff that the women grow around for 3 months or 4 months around their houses, vegetables, and that is sold into the urban areas. That's the cash or excess. Those are the 2 things. Men, after the agriculture cycle, go out to work as laborers. And that's another third income that they get. Now, there is no exploitation that way because the women prefer to be working because if they don't, they won't have a voice in the house. So I would rather work than I can say what I want to say and be heard. But the contractual laborers that you have busloads come and they take these laborers out into the mechanized farming. And they give them, like if you see the farms, it's like contiguous kind of farms. And it's 40 acres per guy. And now these people are not from the same village that are working on this mechanized. I'm giving you the answer to the exploitative part. These people are not from the same village. They might be all Arab, Sudanese, Muslim, but being from the same village is very important for support. Here you have no support. Everything, the next guy at the mechanized is somebody else, another guy from somewhere else. So there is a kind of depression that happens also when things fall apart on some of these farms. The exploitative part on those kinds of contractual laborers comes when you realize that everything you need, you have to either borrow or buy. And at the end of their agriculture cycle, they take all your produce, they sell it for you, and give you what you earn. And sometimes what you earn after you have paid up all this stuff, which you didn't have to do when you were on a subsistence farming. So that is part of, this is the work that I was referring to by Barnett. This is part of the exploitation part that comes up when you look at the model that was built for the Jazeera scheme is built for many other schemes, and it really doesn't work. So Sudan was the breadbasket for the Middle East and North Africa up to 1970. And slowly it starts to decline as more and more farms are given to crop production, non-consumable crops. And now, I'm sure you heard from time to time, they have famine. When I hear famine in the Sudan, for me, it doesn't sit right. Something is really structurally wrong.
Can I ask you another question? With regard to the white grain that is now consumed primarily, a similar thing happens in India as a result of the Green Revolution and the PDS distribution structures, which makes us a surplus producer of grains, but it also essentially also means that everywhere subsidized purchase of grains is white grains, and there's as a result of which there's a more the bread basket is now has much less variety, much less nutrition, and so forth.
And where does it come from, this so-called white grain? Where does it come from?
It comes from it's centralized now. So it comes from
produced in India, or it comes from abroad?
In India.
For a while it was coming from abroad.
Now it is produced in India.
Yeah.
But it leads to decreasing nutrition, and this seems to not be. Is there a similar redistribution of grains, or is Sudan importing?
Yeah, because when they go to buy, if they're working and when they go out to buy their grain, if a husband is working on, you cannot eat cotton, right? You can't, that's what they produce. You have to sell it and wait until it's sold to get your money so you can buy your grain. And what kind of grain? More and more farms are not producing millet. They're producing, they're not producing, or sesame. If they produce, is very little. So they have to buy your grain from the market. And what's available is this cheap white wheat. And so that becomes, it adds to their lack of proper health and so forth.
Hello, ma'am. You talked about kinship labor, where the work that they do is accountable as helping the family in the work, and they are not really paid for it. So, ma'am, is there a parallel between even middle-class women all around, especially in India, if we see the household work that they do, they are not paid for it, they are not financially accountable. So what is the problem? How do we make them financially accountable? Is there a problem of they not being paid for it in terms of cash? Or is there some other problem that we are indirectly alluding to when we are talking about kinship labor and not being paid for it? That's one question.
But wait, let's clarify that question. You're talking about the rural areas or the urban areas?
I'm talking about the rural areas predominantly.
Yeah, you don't get paid for kinship labor because you're eating the food that you produce.
Yes. So is there a way of making it financially inclusive? A financial inclusion, the household work being financially inclusive.
So a husband and wife are producing this food. The only way to make them financial is to sell it and then divide the income. Is that what you're saying?
No, I also was talking about that most of the work that women do, it is the measure of a development of the country, even if you talk in terms of GDP, is in such a way that these are not in numeric terms, and they can in numeric terms, so they cannot be held accountable. So even if women contribute.
Yeah. No, it doesn't, and we know that. That's why they're always left out. I don't know how else they would work it. Who would sort of be paying that kind of labor? It's surely not the husband because he can't afford it. He can basically barely make ends meet. So that kind of labor, yeah, is never accounted for. But it's the same in the United States. Nobody pays the work that women do in houses. But JNU solved the problem. There was a big graffiti on one of the walls, and it said, if women were paid for the work they did, they will be multimillionaires today. I mean, they're right, but that ain't gonna happen.
Yes, ma'am. And my second question is, when we talk about women working on farms, so we have my question was, is religion playing a role? Because in Sudan we see Arab Muslims, and if we take example of Kenya, even there women are involved in farming and doing a lot of subsistence farming work, very similar. Ma'am, is there a role of religion, of being Arab Muslims or not being Arab Muslims, that works into play?
No, religion actually doesn't forbid them from doing it, and religion doesn't dictate them for doing it. There is more of a tacit cultural understanding that if you marry and you are in the rural areas and your husband is involved in agriculture, farming, that it is expected of you to assist. It's not that you are alone working. You, the kids from 5, I mean, the school system is in such that they have the agriculture cycle, the most difficult part of the agriculture cycle, vacation time. So you, the kids, and your husband all work together. So the interesting thing is that religion doesn't dictate it, neither does it forces them to do so. But they do it knowing without it there are no survivors. None of them would survive. Where religion comes in and where culture also comes in a big way is that this allows her from going out of the village in search of a job. There will come a time when actually some of these did go out because they were left in the rural areas with women and children, and they had to go in search of jobs. And the men went also to the cities in search of blue-collar work, and same with the women. But the religion aspect of it, no, it doesn't. But that's a good question. Yes?
I just wanted to make a comment on this kinship labor from the context of this tribal stretch in rural Maharashtra. I mean, the kind of benefits that they have because of the kinship labor, and I'm talking in terms of child care, about women participating and having a say, as you said, you know, in a lot of family decision-making processes, but also when they're formally employed by, you know, a wadi, you know, a orchard or some farming land, they get free, not free, but at least they get time off to perform in kinship labor. And that is such a actually I found a lot of benefits in that, you know, and so there is social security in terms of going from one farm to another, and having that kind of, and a different variety of, you know, pulses and grains that come in by them offering their labor in all their things.
Yeah. No, that's good. Yeah, so there is value. There is one thing I forgot is there is security. You will survive for a woman. She guarantees her security as well as that of her children and husband.
And monetizing it, I think, can create problems instead of, you know, there's a lot of family relationships that go on, and bringing maybe money into the picture would just probably spoil it.
You see, the money into the picture only comes when women were able to sell their own produce that they grow, not what's produced on the farm. That has to be, that is immediately after harvest. The post-production process happens in the village, and it's stored for a year. Now, that will not get sold at all. And the woman makes sure it's not so. She watches and so on. But her vegetables, her crafts, there's a lot of things that they do out of the farm stuff. That is the money that she gets, and she has full control over it. And whatever household expenditure is needed, it comes out of her money. At least 75% of what's needed comes out of her own money. It doesn't come out of the extra money that a man produces, going hiring himself to other farmers through shale or other kind of system. And being in the village, let's say you are a woman and you've just had birth. You're not allowed to work for two years. So culturally, that's what allows, well, that's what this makes this system work, is that for 2 years, she can actually take time off to take care of the kid. People would not allow her. They'll say, I will take her place. Or if a man is a bit wealthier, he will pay for a wage laborer. Or if a man can do so, is to work in somebody else's farm and say, now you owe me work that I've given you, and you work in my farm. So the system works because there is an understanding amongst the villagers. They might hate each other for other reasons, but when it comes to work and they see, you see, sesame, when it's harvested, it has to be harvested immediately. It's the type that the pod opens and it bursts, and then you lose the seed. It has to really be timely harvested. So it works because of these. They are not all of the same tribe, but it works because they are all members of the same village. And they have one village head, and he tells, okay, your farm is not producing, so take another plot, go so far. He gives the permission. He's never said no. And so farms keep changing, depending. After 7 years, you rotate. And so it works that way, not in any other way.
Questions from this side? Otherwise, I can ask my question. So one of the things that struck me was in your talk, you were talking, in a sense, the fact that in the pre-development scenario, if we define development or quote-unquote progress as more technological interventions, inclusion of women in more marketized forms of economies, that the case was that this had the opposite effect in terms of solidifying and making their positions weaker and making them more disempowered within the household. In the Indian situation, what you see is that in many villages, self-help groups have sprung up like mushrooms. And while in some cases they have been useful in giving women more say in the decision-making process, one of the criticisms of self-help groups by feminists have been that they have increased the burden for women. So women are specifically targeted by microfinance organizations because they are seen to be or thought to be, loyal, will pay their loans on time, will not default. So the burden of not only paying back the loans and making, having livelihoods which generate income, but also the double burden of taking care of things at home. So it has in fact increased, while it may have integrated them into the market economy to some extent and given them some say in decision making within the household, but not a huge amount of say, because self-help groups never end up giving them so much money that they can make radical choices like leave abusive marriages, etc. It has increased the burden for women. So I just wanted to ask you what your thoughts are on that, and whether you see something similar happening in the Sudan, and whether there has been a similar penetration of microfinance as well in North Africa.
Not the microfinance part of it. That has not really hit that area yet. But you're right on the if we take the India case, where with microfinance and so forth, that the women can actually do something separate from involving themselves in so-called family type work, family or kinship work. And that can succeed. I mean, I haven't seen it like in Bishnupur, when that is not a rural farm, that's modern. But just to go back, in the case of Bishnupur, both men and women actually work, and I've seen many farming. If you see a documentary film called Seed and Earth, it's exactly about this question, where both men and women are working on the farm on a daily basis, equal partners and so forth. But if that farm were to expand, and you would have to necessitate hiring of people to work on it, then it becomes more and more difficult then for women to do that, because it's extra work, and to run the household. So in the case of what you were referring to, you can have these microfinance kinds of cases where you do have your own employment. You create your own type of activity, and it could be running a poultry, or see that again then necessitates hiring of people. You cannot do it alone. It adds to your burden. You have to do that. And unless you and your husband are in agreement that you give that up and we do this together, it really becomes insurmountable. And it creates new tensions in the household. In one case where a woman decided she didn't want to work on the farm anymore, and she wanted to just maybe, what was it that she wanted to do? She didn't have a poultry, eggs. She was more interested in the selling of eggs and so on. And it became too much for her, because it was still expected that she go back. Because she gave up the job on the farm, she chose another activity. They say, okay, you can do that, but you're still going to have to run. So I don't think that the case is different for rural Indian women compared to what I was saying earlier on. Unless something can be done about shared chores that are not still labeled male and female, but it's still labeled as female. And I'm talking about the chores that are like nurturing, socializing, the chores that are running of household, the domestic sort of process and cycle of the everyday, which it can be insurmountable for one person. Yeah.
Are there any more questions?
In terms of, there's a lot of, oftentimes it's remarked that people from the villages would want to leave the villages, right, and move to the cities. So outside of, say, external development interventions and so forth, and in this region of Sudan, do you see that kind of an urge, if you would, that village families, subsistence farmers, would prefer not being subsistence farmers, assuming there is no drought or things are okay?
Yeah, children, especially of farmers, don't necessarily want to do that. It's hard. They see how difficult it is. They are the ones who do the weed in one and weed in two. You bend the whole day in the heat. I don't know if Sudan is worse than here, because it's dry heat. Sometimes it goes up to 120. And that's the time of the day that you do some of this work. So yeah, I'm sure if they were to do that and go to school, they will not end up doing. Once primary education becomes a must and doable, some of them don't return to the farm, and they go and become blue-collar workers in small industries, small-scale industries, manual labor. That's what they become, mechanics, and it still earns a living. It's difficult, but it's of a different sort difficulty, and they become disjointed and from the farm. Many actually don't go back again. They say, I am from so-and-so, but I haven't been there in so long.
And that is a preferable situation compared to the security that we talked about earlier,
Yeah.
right? That's
Well,
a sacrifice.
especially if the dissolution of the farm itself has already happened, then the son will not take over and run it himself. For sure, he won't run it. Many of them are actually have gone. And some of these villages would have 30 households, maybe then in about 10 or 15 years, there will be maybe 10, 15, and it lessens and lessens. The out-migration from the rural areas, especially with difficulty of drought, desertification. I didn't talk about desertification. When you have mechanized agriculture, you have to just eliminate everything on site. And you know, the Sudan is on the edge of the Sahara Desert. I used to joke when I went to America for college. They say, where do you live? I said, I'm next door to the Sahara Desert. And they couldn't understand. Americans don't have good sense of geography anyway. So so there's the wind from in the evenings that just blows into the area. So if you don't have trees, blocks of, they had big boulders and so on that protected the farm, those areas become susceptible to desertification. I read, when I was doing this work, I read all travels that were left by the British about that whole region, the eastern part of the Sudan. And they talked about animals, wild animals. They talked about, scary kinds of animals that roamed about the area in the jungle. There's no jungle. If you find a tree, you're lucky. Subsistence agriculture was different. If there is a tree, they went around the tree, they went around a big block, so their farm was like this, to keep the environment on which that plot was. So mechanized is just flattened out. And so it becomes, desertification is a serious, serious problem after drought, and it brings about famine. Yeah.
You mentioned that that the women who would sell the vegetables that they grew on their own, and then they use the income for household purposes. And so, what is the change in the kinds of expenditure that has happened since mechanized agriculture?
The men take the produce and sell it for them in the local market and come back with the cash. They tell them how much to sell it for, what, and so on. But when the men migrate to work in the bigger farms, who is going to sell it for them? They can't do that. They can't leave the village to sell it. They wouldn't even know how to do that. They know roads and transport. Secondly, they can't sustain. I mean, they can't just live on that, on the 75% of household income that they get from farming. That eventually also dies. I mean, they can keep it up to a while, but you can't just live on that. It's who sells it for you. There isn't the middleman who used to come and buy. The men actually took it out for them. It's just like here's a system that really works, and then slowly start to disintegrate.
I was actually asking, is there a change in what the household expenditures are?
After the men
Yeah.
go out and work?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I refer to, for when men go and work, the income is controlled by them. If there is any income that's produced from household kinship labor, it's jointly done. And so they can say, okay, this year we'll try to marry our daughter, or this year we can try to buy a new hoe a new plow, you know, those sorts of good, solid discussion. When a man comes from abroad, I mean, from away from home, he has the sole right or how to decide. And there's always a wife that comes in, a new wife, you know, a younger wife. So that happens. A lot of consumable goods, and a lot of, you know, goods like plastic stuff. One of the things I had to also do was each house write down how many shirts do you have, 1 shirt, 2 shirts, 1 shoe, no shoes, how many utensils. I had to document everything that they owned. At the end of the, you know, after the dissolution and so on, I came back. There's a huge amounts of plastic goods in these little thatched roofs. And more kind of consumer sort of goods, flashy sort of consumer goods. So those are the kinds of changes that were going. Before, women make sure if somebody was sick, that the child was given medicine, that the daughter had enough paper and pencils for school. This is a malaria-infested area. She would provide use her income to take the child to the clinic, and there would be a visiting nurse and buy the medicine for. She took care of the essentials of children's health and her health and so on, and provided for farm implement if there is a need for it. Very, very thrifty women, and saved some of the vegetables, dried vegetables. I mean, the things they think about. It just sort of make me think, you know, if I could only do that, maybe I can also be smarter about this. You know, they can teach you something, these women.
Okay, if there are no further questions, I would like to thank Professor Fruzzetti for her lovely talk, and with this we end the colloquium.